3 days after my new sister-in-law told me I was, in her words, glorified kitchen help, a courier delivered an eviction notice and a cease and desist letter to the bakery my brother had been gifted exactly 1 week earlier, informing him that he had 30 days to vacate a building he didn't own and stop using recipes he'd never actually held the rights to in the first place. I wasn't there to see his face when he opened it, and for the first time in 10 years, I found I genuinely didn't need to be in that room to feel like the day had finally gone the way it should have. Before I explain how those documents came to exist, hit subscribe and turn on your notifications, because you'll want to see what happens to a bakery once the person who actually built it back up stops showing up to save it. Tell me in the comments, have you ever quietly protected something you loved, years before anyone gave you a reason to think you'd need to? Welcome to Revenge Stories Narrated, where family betrayal meets inevitable justice and karma always collects its debt. My name is Stella. I'm 36, and for 10 years I worked 80-hour weeks, unpaid beyond a modest weekly stipend my parents called an allowance, well into my 30s, keeping my family's bakery running through 2 recessions, a health inspection scare, and a near bankruptcy that would have closed the doors permanently if I hadn't stepped in exactly when I did. My younger brother, Émile, spent most of that same decade traveling, working odd jobs abroad, and visiting home twice a year for holidays, where our parents introduced him warmly as the family's adventurous spirit, a phrase they never once applied to me, despite the fact that I was the one actually keeping the family's legacy alive back home. The bakery had been in our family for 3 generations by the time I took over daily operations, and by the time I did, it was in serious trouble, back rent owed, a lease about to be forfeited, suppliers threatening to cut us off entirely. My parents, in their 60s by then, and increasingly overwhelmed, asked if I'd be willing to help stabilize things. I said yes, the way I'd said yes to most requests from my family for longer than was probably good for me, and I spent the next several months doing something neither of them fully understood at the time. I personally purchased the building's lease, using savings I'd built from years of careful budgeting, and I formally trademarked our family's signature recipes, the sourdough starter passed down 3 generations, the specific cardamom bun recipe that had made the shop locally famous, under a small LLC I set up in my own name. I did this with my parents' full knowledge and, at the time, their genuine gratitude. They signed off on the paperwork themselves, relieved, in that moment, that someone in the family had a plan. The years that followed were the hardest of my life in ways that are difficult to fully explain to anyone who hasn't rebuilt something from the ground up. 6 in the morning starts, most nights not ending until close to midnight during the busier seasons. I missed 2 close friends' weddings because Saturday mornings meant 300 loaves before the shop opened. I dated exactly 1 person seriously during those 10 years, a relationship that ended, gently but honestly, when he told me he didn't see how there was room in my life for anything beyond the ovens. My hands developed a permanent roughness by year 3 that no amount of lotion ever fully softened again, small burns and flour-dried knuckles that became just another part of how I looked, something I stopped noticing until a stranger commented on it once at a friend's dinner party, and I realized I had no easy way to explain what a decade of that work actually does to a person's body. I didn't resent the work itself. I loved the bakery, genuinely, the smell of it at 5 in the morning, the regulars who'd known me since I was a child handing out samples behind the counter. What I minded, over time, was watching my parents describe the bakery's eventual turnaround, the profit we finally saw in year 8, as a family triumph, while quietly continuing to treat my role in it as something closer to duty than accomplishment. Émile came home permanently about 2 years ago, engaged to a woman named Portia, sharp, elegant, and openly unimpressed by what she described, more than once within my hearing, as the whole small-town bakery thing. She'd grown up in a family with real estate money and treated our shop's flour-dusted counters and worn wooden shelves the way someone might treat a slightly embarrassing hobby a relative refused to outgrow, polite in front of my parents, considerably less so when she thought I wasn't listening. My parents, thrilled to have their golden child settling down at last, began talking almost immediately about the bakery's future in a way that quietly excluded me from the conversation, framing the business's recent success as proof it was finally ready to be handed to the next generation, a phrase that apparently meant Émile specifically, despite the fact that I was very much also part of that generation and had been the one actually running the place for a decade. At Émile and Portia's wedding, my parents stood up during the reception and announced, to a room of nearly 200 guests, that they were gifting the bakery to Émile and his new wife as a wedding present, a business now worth several times what it had been worth when I first stepped in to save it. I sat at my table and clapped along with everyone else, the specific, practiced calm of someone who has learned to absorb a public erasure without letting it show on her face in front of an audience. If you've ever watched something you personally rebuilt get handed to someone else as a gift, in front of a room full of people applauding the decision, hit like right now. I'd love to know in the comments if you've ever kept your composure through a moment that should have broken it. Portia's first official act as co-owner, exactly 1 week later, was to call me into what had been my own office for the past decade and inform me, with the particular brightness of someone delivering news she considered a favor, that the bakery would be streamlining operations going forward and that my role, which she described as glorified kitchen help, was being eliminated effective immediately. Émile stood beside her the entire time and said nothing, which told me everything I needed to know about how this decision had actually been made. I didn't argue. I packed the few personal items I kept in that office, a photo of my grandmother behind the original counter, a chipped mug I'd used every morning for a decade, and I left quietly, the way I'd learned to handle most things in that family. I drove home and called my attorney that same afternoon, not because I needed advice about what to do, since I'd known exactly what I owned for years, but because it was finally time to formally exercise it. 3 days later, Émile received the eviction notice for a building he never actually held the lease to, along with a cease and desist letter preventing him from using either the bakery's name or its signature recipes, both of which had belonged, legally and exclusively, to my LLC since the year I'd stepped in to save the business from closing entirely. My parents called within the hour, first confused, then increasingly frantic as their own attorney confirmed what mine already had, that the paperwork they'd signed themselves years earlier, relieved and grateful at the time, had never once transferred ownership to anyone but me. I opened a new shop 3 weeks later, directly across the street, under my own name this time, using the same recipes, the same starter I'd nurture myself for a decade, legally and entirely mine to use however I chose. Nearly every member of the original staff came with me within the first week, people I'd trained and worked alongside for years, people who understood exactly whose bakery this had actually always been. Most of our regular customers followed within a month, drawn by a starter and a cardamom bun recipe they'd been loyal to for years, long before they'd ever met Émile or heard the word streamlining. The original shop closed within 4 months, unable to legally use the name or recipes that had made it profitable, unable to attract the staff or customer base that had actually built its success, an empty storefront across the street from a bakery now thriving under the name it should have carried all along. My parents have tried, a few times, to broker some kind of reconciliation, careful conversations that always seemed to circle back toward asking whether I'd be willing to let Émile back in some capacity, a request I declined, gently but firmly, every time. I still see my parents occasionally for holidays mostly, though something has shifted permanently in how those visits feel. My mother mentioned once, quietly, near the end of a Sunday dinner, that she hadn't understood at the time what she was actually giving away when she signed those papers with me all those years ago, an admission that came closer to an apology than anything she'd offered since the wedding, though she still hasn't said the word itself. I don't carry much anger about it anymore. What I carry instead is something closer to relief, the specific, steady satisfaction of finally running a business that is, in every legal and practical sense, entirely and unquestionably mine, built on a decade of work nobody can hand away to someone else ever again. If you've ever quietly protected something you built, long before anyone gave you a reason to think you'd need to, tell me about it in the comments. Subscribe if you want more stories like this one, and I'll see you in the next.